For centuries, the papacy has stood as a symbol of holiness, power, and divine authority. But behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, not everything was as sacred as it appeared. Some popes, far from being paragons of purity, were men entangled in lust, scandal, and corruption, so disturbing that even their contemporaries whispered in horror. These weren't just spiritual leaders, they were kings of sin, men whose intimate secrets reshaped the very church they were sworn to protect. Tonight, we peel back the veil on some of the most shocking scandals ever to stain the papal throne, from forbidden affairs and illegitimate children to dark conspiracies of murder and betrayal. The history of the papacy is filled with secrets, so twisted they rarely spoken of in churches today. But before we dive into this shadowed history, a quick reminder. If you're fascinated by the darker, stranger side of medieval history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep bringing you the stories history tried to bury. Now let us step into an age when the papacy was not just a holy office, but a stage for lust, greed, and blood. The early medieval church struggled to uphold celibacy, but temptation proved stronger than vows, and in some cases, popes didn't just break their oaths in secret. They flaunted their scandals so openly that Rome became known less for its holiness and more for its corruption. Perhaps the most infamous example came during the so-called Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy. This was the 9th and 10th centuries, when Rome itself was a battlefield of ambition. Powerful families clawed for influence over the papal throne, and women of ambition discovered that seduction could be as powerful as any sword. At the center of this chaos stood Theodora, a noblewoman accused by chroniclers of using her beauty and lovers to bend popes to her will. But it was her daughter, Marozia, who would etch her name into history as the woman who scandalized the Vatican like no other. Marozia became the lover of Pope Sergius III, and their affair allegedly produced a child who would one day sit on the papal throne, himself as Pope John XI. Imagine the blasphemy in the eyes of the faithful. A pope fathering a pope. The throne of St. Peter turned into a family heirloom. But Marozia's ambition didn't stop there. She pulled the strings of Rome's politics like a master puppeteer, marrying into power, removing rivals, and ensuring her family's grip on the papacy remained unbroken. Even Pope John X, once her ally and lover, eventually fell victim to her schemes. When he grew too independent, she had him imprisoned and killed. This period became known as the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots. Chroniclers described it as the lowest point in papal history, when the Vatican was not guided by God, but by lust, manipulation, and bloodshed. The papacy had become a scandalous court of power, where intimacy was just another tool of control. And yet, even as Marozia's reign ended with her imprisonment and disgrace, the papacy's descent into scandal was far from over. What followed in the centuries ahead would make even the pornocracy seem tame, as popes turned the Vatican into a palace of forbidden pleasure, dangerous secrets, and unspeakable sins. The pornocracy may have been one of the most infamous stains on the papacy, but it was only the beginning of a long, winding descent into scandal. For while the early medieval popes were entangled in affairs of power and lust, the Renaissance popes took corruption and decadence to heights that shocked even their contemporaries. Rome, which was supposed to be the center of Christian piety, became a playground for extravagance, politics, and secret indulgences. One of the most notorious names to emerge from this age was Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. Even before he claimed the papal throne in 1492, he was infamous for his womanizing, his illegitimate children, and his ruthless ambition. Once crowned, however, he transformed the papacy into something closer to a family dynasty than a spiritual office. The Borgia Pope openly acknowledged his many children, including the infamous Cesare and Lucretia Borgia, both of whom became legendary figures for their cunning, ruthlessness, and whispered scandals. For the faithful of Europe, the sight of a pope doting on his mistresses and elevating his illegitimate offspring to power was a grotesque betrayal of everything the church was meant to represent. Contemporary accounts even describe shocking scenes inside the Vatican itself. One of the most infamous stories tells of the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts, a lavish gathering where courtesans danced naked for cardinals, and prizes were given to the men who could indulge in the most debauchery. While historians still debate how much of this account is truth and how much is exaggerated rumor, the very fact that people believed it speaks volumes about Alexander's reputation. But his intimate scandals didn't just involve his lovers or his children, they extended to politics. Enemies whispered that Alexander had encouraged incest between his children, particularly between Lucretia and Caesar, in order to keep the family's power tightly bound. Whether true or not, these rumors spread like wildfire, fueling a legend of depravity that still haunts the Borgia name today. Yet, Alexander was far from the only Renaissance pope to tarnish the papacy with intimate scandal. His successor, Pope Julius II, was no saint either. Nicknamed the Warrior Pope, Julius was notorious for his violent temper, his military campaigns, and his blatant disregard for celibacy. Whispers in Rome claimed he kept both mistresses and male lovers. His hypocrisy so open that satirical pamphlets accused him of bringing disease into the very walls of the Vatican. And then came Pope Leo X, a Medici by birth, whose indulgence in pleasure and excess bankrupted the papacy and directly fueled Martin Luther's Reformation. While Leo was less infamous for his private liaisons than for his gluttony and greed, his court was filled with rumors of hidden vices, feasts of unimaginable decadence, and an obsession with pleasure over piety. These Renaissance popes lived more like kings or emperors of indulgence than holy men. They waged wars, seduced mistresses, and turned the Vatican into a stage where sins were hidden under a thin veil of holiness. And while the faithful outside Rome struggled with poverty, the papacy's elite reveled in wealth, intimacy, and scandals so shocking that reformers across Europe began to demand change. The intimate scandals of the papacy during this era were not just personal failings, they shook the very foundations of the Catholic Church. Faithful Christians wondered, how could these men, who indulged in sins greater than those of the average believer, possibly claim to be the representatives of God on earth? And as the Renaissance gave way to the Reformation, the papacy would face its greatest crisis yet, because the scandals of its leaders had left the Church vulnerable to a storm of outrage, reform, and revolution. By the time the 16th century dawned, the papacy had already become synonymous with corruption, lust, and whispered sins. But the scandals that unfolded during the years of the Reformation would prove even more destructive because now the intimate failings of the popes were not just private embarrassments. They became weapons used by critics to tear down the authority of Rome itself. One of the most infamous figures of this period was Pope Paul III. Like many of his predecessors, Paul was no stranger to indulgence, and instead of hiding them away in shamas, one might expect from the leader of Christendom, he openly flaunted them. His daughters were married into noble houses, and his sons were showered with wealth and power. The nepotism was so blatant that Romans began calling him the father of the people, but not for reasons of charity. Even within the Vatican, whispers circulated that Paul's private life remained far from saintly. Satirical verses mocked him as a man who preached chastity while indulging in secret pleasures. And while he attempted to reform some aspects of the Church in response to Martin Luther's criticisms, the stain of his intimate reputation lingered. For many Europeans, Paul symbolized the hypocrisy at the very heart of the papacy. But if Paul was corrupt, Pope Sixtus IV a few decades earlier was an even darker figure. Many claimed that Sixtus not only appointed his nephews and favorites to high offices, but that he also kept young men as lovers, indulging in relationships that shocked even his contemporaries. Some chroniclers accused him of transforming the Vatican into a place where lust was openly traded for influence and power. And yet, even these rumors paled compared to the notorious reputation of Pope Julius III. Julius shocked Rome by elevating a teenage boy, Innocenzo Ciocchi del Monte, to the rank of cardinal. The scandal wasn't just about the boy's youth or lack of education, it was about the nature of their relationship. Gossip spread that Julius had taken the boy as a lover after meeting him in a far less holy setting, a street brawl. The entire Christian world watched in disbelief as the Pope lavished titles, wealth, and power upon the young man, who soon became infamous for his arrogance and immorality. These stories fueled the growing fire of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and his followers seized upon the papacy's intimate scandals as evidence that Rome was beyond redemption. Pamphlets circulated across Europe, portraying the popes not as holy fathers, but as decadent tyrants. Men more interested in their own pleasures than the salvation of their flock. And indeed, it was hard to argue otherwise when the Vatican itself seemed like a palace of indulgence. Feasts, mistresses, and lovers filled the papal courts. the very walls that should have echoed with prayer and devotion. Instead hid whispered sins that rivaled the tales of pagan emperors of old. But what made these scandals truly horrific was not just the hypocrisy, was the way they destroyed faith. Ordinary Christians, already burdened by poverty and heavy tithes, looked at the wealth and indulgence of the popes and saw only betrayal. The intimate scandals of Rome became proof that the papacy no longer represented God, but human vice dressed in robes of holiness. And as the 16th century unfolded, bloodshed and centuries of division that forever changed the face of Christianity. The tale of Pope Julius III and Innocenzo Ciocchi del Monte deserves more than just a passing mention, because it is often regarded as one of the most humiliating scandals to ever stain the papal throne. When Julius first encountered Innocenzo, the boy was barely in his teens and came from a humble, even disreputable background. Accounts differ, but one version claims that Julius discovered him after a fight on the streets of Parma, where the young man had been working as a servandor. Some sources suggest a beggar. Whatever the truth, Julius became infatuated with him almost instantly. Within a short time, he brought Innocenzo into his household, and from there the boy's fortunes rose in a way that stunned the Vatican and scandalized all of Europe. Julius showered him with affection, gifts, and power. At just 17, Innocenzo was made a cardinal position that should have been reserved for the most learned and devout men of the Church. He was also granted enormous wealth, land, and influence, all because of the Pope's favoritism. But the real outrage came from what happened behind closed doors. Rumors swirled that Innocenzo was not just Julius's protege, but his lover. Diplomats from other nations reported back to their courts about the shocking intimacy between the Pope and his cardinal boy. The scandal spread like wildfire, and Protestant reformers eagerly used it as proof that the Catholic Church was morally bankrupt. Pamphlets mocked the Vatican as a den of sin, and Julius as a man enslaved by lust. What made matters worse was Innocenzo's own behavior. Far from being a quiet and grateful beneficiary of Julius's protection, he grew arrogant, violent, and corrupt. In Rome, he became infamous for his drunken brawls, reckless spending, and constant affairs with both women and men. He was even accused of several violent crimes, including murder, but thanks to the protection of the Pope, he often escaped punishment. The Vatican, meanwhile, fell into chaos. Cardinals and bishops whispered among themselves, furious that a street urchin had been elevated above them. Rival families in Rome fumed as they watched Innocenzo flaunt his power, and yet Julius, blinded by affection, ignored their protests. To him, Innocenzo was untouchable. But scandals of this magnitude could not remain hidden forever. When word spread across Europe, Protestant leaders seized on the affair as a perfect weapon against Rome. They portrayed Julius as a depraved old man, who had corrupted not only himself but also the sacred office of the papacy. In sermons and pamphlets, Julius became a symbol of everything the reformers despised: lust, corruption, and hypocrisy. Even after Julius's death, the shadow of Innocenzo's presence lingered. Despite being stripped of some of his titles, Innocenzo remained wealthy and influential for decades. He lived as a constant reminder of how far the papacy had fallen into scandal. This episode was not just an embarrassment for Rome, it was devastating. It gave the Church's enemies undeniable proof that the Vatican was not a place of holiness, but a court of vice. And it left ordinary Christians questioning how they could ever trust leaders who seemed more concerned with indulgence than salvation. Yet the tragedy of Julius III and Innocenzo was only one chapter in a long saga of papal intimacy gone wrong. For the Vatican had been plagued by such scandals for centuries, and worse was yet to come. If the story of Julius III and Innocenzo shocked the world, the scandals of the infamous Borgia family took corruption and intimate depravity to an entirely new level. To this day, the very name Borgia evokes images of poison, betrayal, and forbidden lust. And at the center of it all stood Rodrigo Borgia, better known to history as Pope Alexander VI. When Rodrigo became pope in 1492, he already carried with him the reputation of a man far more interested in power and pleasure than holiness. Unlike other popes who tried to hide their affairs, Alexander did not even bother. His mistresses were well known, his illegitimate children were openly acknowledged, and the papal court itself transformed into something resembling a royal palace of indulgence rather than a holy institution. The most infamous of his relationships was with a woman named Vanessa de Catani, with whom he fathered 4 children, Cesar Juan, Lucretia. Later, he became deeply involved with Julia Farnese, who was so young when she entered his life that she was often mocked by contemporaries as the Pope's bride. Julia was described as extraordinarily beautiful, and Alexander flaunted her in public in a way that scandalized even Rome, where people were used to clerical corruption. But Alexander's indulgence in women was only the beginning. The papal palace during his reign became notorious for wild feasts, gambling, and what contemporaries described as orgiastic banquets. Chroniclers tell us that the Borgia court once hosted the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, a gathering where courtesans danced naked before high-ranking clergy, and prizes were awarded to men who could perform the most intimate acts. Whether exaggerated or not, the story captured the imagination of Europe, cementing the Borgias as the ultimate symbol of papal corruption. Even more shocking were the whispers about Alexander's relationship with his daughter, Lucretia Borgia. Rumors spread that the Pope and his son, Cesar, both shared an unnatural affection for her, and many believed she was not just a pawn in their political games, but also caught up in their darker desires. Though historians debate how much of this was truth and how much was propaganda from their enemies, the fact that such rumors existed at Aland were widely believed reveals how scandalous the Borgia family appeared to contemporaries. Alexander VI's reign was not just a moral disaster, it was also a political catastrophe. By flaunting his mistresses, indulging his children, and turning the Vatican into a spectacle of corruption, he gave the enemies of the Church more ammunition than they could have dreamed of. The reformers pointed to him as proof that the papacy was rotten to the core, and even loyal Catholics felt their faith shaken. And yet, Alexander ruled for over a decade, enriching his family, consolidating power, and turning the papacy into his personal dynasty, when he finally died in 1503, possibly poisoned. According to rumor, he left behind a Vatican so drenched in scandal that it would take generations to recover its dignity. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Borgia papacy was not just the corruption or the lust, it was the brazenness. Alexander and his family did not bother to hide their behavior. They paraded it openly, as though the seat of St. Peter was nothing more than a throne for kings and tyrants. For many across Europe, it was the final straw, the undeniable proof that the papacy had lost its soul. And yet, the Borgias were far from the only popes to entangle themselves in such scandals. If anything, their notoriety overshadowed the equally horrifying intimate lives of later pontiffs, men who cloaked themselves in holiness, while secretly indulging in desires that would shake Christendom to its core. As we move beyond the Borgias, the shadow of scandal only grows darker. Rodrigo Borgia may have been the most infamous, but he was far from the only pope whose private life became a public nightmare. The Renaissance and early modern eras were filled with pontiffs whose supposed devotion to God was betrayed by their intimate appetites, their abuse of power, and their willingness to indulge in desires that shocked even a world already accustomed to clerical corruption. Take Pope Sixtus IV, for example. Today, he is remembered for commissioning the Sistine Chapel. But in his own time, he was just as notorious for the young men who surrounded him. Rumors circulated that he kept a circle of handsome male companions in the Vatican, showering them with wealth and church offices. His nepotism was so blatant that the word nepotism itself, meaning favoritism, toward nephews was popularized during his reign. But many of these so-called nephews were not nephews at all, but alleged lovers. The whispers of Rome accused Sixtus of filling the church with men who shared his bed, all under the guise of family ties. Then came Pope Paul II, whose vanity and indulgence scandalized even hardened Roman citizens. Known for his obsession with luxury, jewels, and fine clothes, Paul was mocked as the peacock pope, but behind the ridicule was something more sinister. Roman chroniclers accused him of keeping young boys as his companions and indulging in relationships that, if true, would have been considered not only scandalous but criminal. After his sudden death in 1471, his enemies even spread lurid rumors that he had died in the act with a young page. Whether slander or truth, the very fact that such rumors circulated freely shows how tarnished the papal office had become. And then there was Leo X, the Medici Pope. Outwardly, he was a patron of the arts, the man who sponsored Raphael and helped usher in the High Renaissance. But his personal life was clouded by whispers of intimate excess. He was accused of surrounding himself with beautiful young men, of hosting extravagant feasts, and of indulging in pleasures that drained the papal treasury. At the same time, his corruption reached into the very heart of the Church. It was Leo who authorized the sale of indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica, a practice that enraged Martin Luther and helped spark the Protestant Reformation. What's striking is how these scandals intertwined lust, money, and power. The intimate lives of the popes were not just private indiscretions, they had global consequences. Sixtus's favoritism fueled wars in Italy. Paul II's reputation for debauchery eroded respect for the papacy. Leo X's indulgence in both pleasure and greed directly set off one of the greatest religious upheavals in history. But the papal scandals did not always revolve around men and boys. Some were tied to women who moved within the Vatican's orbit, women who became entangled in the passions of the pontiffs. Mistresses, courtesans, and noblewomen all left their mark on the history of papal lust. Some wielded enormous power behind the scenes, shaping policies and manipulating the popes who desired them. Yet perhaps the most disturbing of all were the whispers about the Vatican's own secret brothels, places where priests and even popes were said to indulge themselves. Chroniclers described entire houses in Rome filled with women, kept for the pleasure of the clergy, and there were times when the Pope himself was accused of patronizing them. To outsiders, the Vatican seemed less like the center of Christendom and more like the palace of a corrupt emperor, cloaking sin in holy robes. And for ordinary believers, peasants, merchants, even nobles who genuinely looked to Rome as a symbol of divine authority, these stories were devastating. To see the Pope, the supposed representative of Christ, accused of lust, abuse, and indulgence, was not just scandalous, it was faith-shattering. For many, it was proof that the papacy had become little more than a theater of hypocrisy, where piety was a mask hiding the darkest of desires. But as shocking as these Renaissance scandals were, they were not the end of the story. The papacy's most disturbing intimate secrets would not vanish with the fall of the Borgias or the rise of the Medici. In fact, some of the most horrifying tales of clerical lust, abuse, and hidden sins would emerge in later centuries. As the Vatican desperately tried to silence its past, while the world watched more closely than ever before, by the time of the Counter-Reformation, the papacy was trying desperately to clean up its image. The Protestant Reformation had unleashed a tidal wave of criticism, and Rome knew that every intimate scandal weakened its authority. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, tried to restore discipline among the clergy, enforcing stricter rules on celibacy and morality. But rules on paper often did little to curb appetites behind closed doors. The more the Vatican attempted to project holiness, the more people whispered about the sins it hid. One of the most notorious examples comes from Pope Julius III, who ruled in the mid-16th century. At first, he was celebrated as a reformer, but his personal life quickly destroyed that image. Julius raised a young man named Innocenzo del Monte from complete obscurity, literally plucking him off the streets of Parma, where he had been working as a servant hand, elevated him to positions of enormous influence. This young man, who is rumored to be Julius's lover, became a cardinal despite being completely uneducated and unqualified. Roman society was scandalized. Whispers spread that Julius had made his bedmate a prince of the church. Even Catholic historians later admitted that Julius's favoritism nearly ruined the papacy's reputation forever. Another shocking case is Pope Urban VIII in the 17th century, a member of the powerful Barberini family. Urban is remembered as the pope who persecuted Galileo, but his intimate scandals were just as notorious. Accusations swirled about his indulgence in women, his favoritism toward his handsome relatives, and his lavish entertainments. In Rome, satire was a weapon, and broadsheets circulated mocking him as a pope more interested in carnal pleasures than in defending the faith. Perhaps the most grotesque episode of this era came from Pope Alexander VII, whose pontificate in the mid-1600s was tainted by rumors of orgies and hidden brothels tied to the Vatican itself. Some accounts claimed that prostitutes were kept on retainer to serve high-ranking clerics, and that the Pope turned a blind eye to the debauchery. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they reveal how deeply the association between the papacy and secret intimacy had embedded itself in the public imagination. And then there was Pope Clement VII, whose reign coincided with Henry VIII's infamous break from Rome. While he is remembered mostly for refusing Henry's annulment, contemporaries accused him of hypocrisy, claiming that Clement's private life was far from the purity he demanded of others. Rumors of mistresses and illegitimate children followed him, even as he tried to defend the sanctity of marriage in England. By the 18th century, the intimate scandals of the papacy became even harder to conceal. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe seized on every rumor, every whisper, and every accusation to portray the Catholic Church as a nest of corruption and hypocrisy. Voltaire, one of the fiercest critics of the Church, filled his writings with references to papal debauchery. Pamphlets circulated that claimed the Vatican was home to hidden harems, secret passages linking the papal apartments to convents, and even ritualistic orgies disguised as religious ceremonies. Were all of these accusations true? Probably not. Many were exaggerated or fabricated by enemies of the Church. But the fact that they were so readily believed shows how far the papacy's reputation had fallen. For centuries, stories of popes with mistresses, popes with lovers of both sexes, and popes who lived like emperors rather than saints had created an image of the Vatican as a palace of lust. By the time these tales reached the wider public in the Enlightenment, people were prepared to accept the worst. But the most shocking revelations were yet to come. For even as the papacy tried to present itself as the guardian of morality, new scandals would emerge in the 19th and 20th century stories, not just of hypocrisy, but of abuse, exploitation, and intimate crimes that would shake the Church to its core. These were not just whispered rumors or satirical pamphlets. They were real, documented horrors that the Vatican could no longer laugh off as slander. As the papacy moved into the modern age, it could no longer hide behind the walls of secrecy and medieval power. Newspapers, diplomacy, and the rise of secular governments meant that the intimate scandals of the Vatican could not be buried so easily. What had once been whispered in taverns and gossiped about in Roman streets was now printed in pamphlets and reported across Europe. The scandals of the papacy began to look less like rumors and more like undeniable truths. One of the most infamous cases was that of Pope Pius IX, who reigned longer than any pope in history, 1846 to 1878. He was hailed as a defender of Catholic tradition, but he also oversaw a papacy drowning in accusations of corruption and hypocrisy. While Pius himself was not known for mistresses or lovers, his court was filled with cardinals and bishops, notorious for their double lives. Roman society mocked them as princes of pleasure, men who wore robes of scarlet by day and indulged in secret affairs by night. Pius chose silence, preferring to protect the Church's image rather than confront its internal corruption. Even more controversial was the case of Pope Leo XIII, who reigned at the end of the 19th century. Leo promoted himself as a moral reformer. But documents from the era reveal Vatican cover-ups of clergy accused of exploiting nuns and even children. Instead of public punishment, the Vatican quietly reassigned priests, hoping the scandal would fade. The strategy of secrecy may have worked in earlier centuries, but in an age of growing media, it only deepened suspicions that the papacy was hiding far worse than it admitted. And then came Pope Pius XII during the Second World War. While most debates around his papacy focus on his silence during the Holocaust, there were also shocking whispers about the Vatican under his leadership. Critics accused the papal court of hypocrisy. Priests and cardinals indulged in private vices, while publicly condemning the moral corruption of the modern world. Reports surfaced of hidden children, fathered by priests of convents, abused as private harems, and of secret payments made to silence scandalous revelations. By the mid-20th century, the world was beginning to see the papacy's intimate scandals, not as isolated rumors, but as part of a pattern of deep and systemic hypocrisy. And when the 21st century arrived, the floodgates burst open. Investigations across Europe, North America, and beyond revealed horrific abuse within the Church, with cases reaching back decades, sometimes centuries. These were not just stories of mistresses or hidden lovers. They were tales of exploitation, of silenced victims, and of a culture of secrecy rooted in the very traditions of the Vatican itself. The irony could not be darker. For centuries, popes had condemned ordinary men and women for their sexual sins, painting themselves as guardians of morality. They issued edicts on celibacy, marriage, and purity, insisting that the faithful live by impossibly strict standards. Yet behind closed doors, the papacy was entangled in some of the most intimate scandals of history. From medieval orgies and Renaissance mistresses to modern cover-ups of abuse, the story of the papacy's intimate secrets is one of power, hypocrisy, and hidden darkness. And so, we arrive at the disturbing conclusion. The papacy, an institution that claimed divine authority over human morality, has been haunted by its own desires and its own scandals. Perhaps the most horrific part of this story is not any one pope or any one act, but the centuries of silence, denial, and complicity that allowed these intimate scandals to shape history. If history teaches us anything, it is that power and secrecy are a dangerous mix. And when an institution claims absolute moral authority, its own sins become all the more shocking. The scandals of the papacy remind us that behind the robes, the rituals, and the claims of holiness, there were and perhaps still are flawed human beings, capable of the darkest hypocrisy.